The webinar is not. Hey, did you see that it stopped for a second?
Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Creating Authentic Communities in Education and Beyond. It's a book launch and a discussion with the author, Dr. Beth Sarah Wright. I'm Dan Heischman, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Association for Episcopal Schools. And it's my pleasure to be in discussion with Dr. Wright about this new and very important book, particularly at this time in the life of our country and in our schools. Thinking about authentic communities is vitally important. You will be muted for this webinar, but you will have a chance in the Q&A feature to ask questions, and there will be a time at the end of our discussion for some of those questions to be directed to Dr. Wright. Thank you again for being with us this evening. Atlanta-based author and speaker Dr. Beth Sarah Wright advocates for authenticity in our communities, no matter what our context, by aligning our aspirational identities with our lived realities. She's the author of 5 books, most recently Dignity, 7 Strategies for Creating Authentic Community, which lays out a comprehensive lens through which to view and solve for insidious barriers to authenticity. She's a former college professor at Spelman College, as well as NYU. She currently serves as Director of Enrollment Management at Holy Innocents Episcopal School in Atlanta, and serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the Emory School of Medicine in Atlanta. She holds a PhD in Performance Studies from New York University, an MPhil in Anthropology from Cambridge University, and a BA magna cum laude from Princeton University in Sociology and African American Studies. She's married to Robert Wright, the Episcopal Bishop of Atlanta, and they are parents to 5 children. So I'm going to start by asking Dr. Wright and welcoming her. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, Dr. Wright, about your educational and career journey and what has brought you to this moment.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. And thank you all who have come to join us this evening. Well, let's get right to it. My educational journey has in many ways been the narrative of all of my writing, all of my thinking, and has brought me to this place today. As you so wonderfully read, I am from Jamaica. And I grew up there. I went to school there from kindergarten to 11th grade. And then I went to a school in Scotland, Edinburgh, Scotland, ended up going to a boarding school, actually a boys' school with 400 boys and 20 girls. I was the only Jamaican and certainly the only Black girl there. Then I came to this country, to Princeton University, to do my BA, and then went back to England to do my master's at Cambridge University, and then came back to the US to do my PhD in New York at NYU. And I share that to say that I've been in all these different educational contexts, but also in international contexts. And I've always found myself in situations where I am asking, where I'm dealing with people who are different than I am, different educational contexts, different backgrounds, different cultures, different identities, and grappling with the question of how do I see others in those contexts? How am I seen? How do we see each other? How are we perceived? And using that, making sense of that context to then think about larger issues of identity, of authenticity, of questioning just who we are and how we position ourselves in the world. So all of that is my background and the narrative really for where I am today. And I find myself now working in an institution, educational institution, and bringing that to bear, all of that in this context.
Now, you've now written 5 books. Can you identify any common threads to those books?
Yes. So I would say that I started writing to make meaning out of the different experiences that I had and that I found myself in. And at the core of all of these experiences, yes, is identity, is belonging, is authenticity, is aligning who we are in different contexts. As you will see, the first few books that I wrote were about advocating for mental health, destigmatizing clinical depression, and encouraging people who are facing this very difficult situation to bring their authentic selves to healing, to tell their stories and all parts of their stories. So while I have worked on in mental health, and then I wrote a spiritual novel, and then now I'm writing about educational and institutional change and shifts and challenges, at the core of all of that is authenticity and really essentially dignity.
Speaking of which, you use the question, will you respect the dignity of every human being, as a launching pad for this book. Why that question?
So, Dan, I am a lifelong believer. I have been an Episcopalian or Anglican all my life, and one of the things that we see every Sunday in our Episcopal covenant, a baptismal covenant, is this question, will you respect the dignity of every human being? And I started looking at that question in very, very new ways with relatively recent experiences. It is such a provocative question that really challenges us to begin to think differently about how we interact with others in the world, and how we interact with ourselves, how we live out our institutional identities. Will you respect the dignity of every human being? Most instructive in that question, it's not asking if you will love every human being. It's not asking if you'll get along with every human being. It's not even asking if we would be polite to every human being. It is, will you respect their dignity? There is such gravitas in that question. And I really wanted to grapple with that, because that to me is the core of true transformational change. But most importantly, there are several wonderful ways to think about that question, but for now, I would like to say that the first word, will, is extremely instructive, because any sort of change, any sort of transformation will not occur without the will, without intentionality. And I would like to encourage that. And this is not in response to certain things, or it's not in response to something that has happened. It is not a knee-jerk reaction. This is an intentional approach to how we can grapple with certain institutional challenges that we face.
This is a webinar audience of mostly people from schools, and school people are very used to using the term respect. But you use it in a very different way, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
So when I was looking into that question, will you respect the dignity of every human being, I was struck by the etymological meaning of the word respect. Re, again, spectacle, to look, spectacle like spectacles, to see, to look again. So it is asking, will you look again at the dignity in every human being? And what I like about that is that it is an action. It is asking us to take up a certain amount of agency to do something different, to change our behavior. When we encounter people, when we encounter difference, when we encounter even challenges, we see them a certain way. We bring to those, to that moment, assumptions about what we're seeing. We bring to that moment stereotypes. We may even bring biases. We all have them, every single one of us, because we are all living human beings. We are impacted and have influenced by many parts of life. So when we come to those moments, what that question to me is asking is, will you look? Yes, you will see, but will you pay attention and be aware of those assumptions and those biases? Pause and look again. And when we look again, be open and be curious and look for what we as human beings share, our common humanity and our dignity. Can we look again at our dignity?
And it also involves, if we don't get it right the first time, to be able to looking again. It's always good to look again on the first try, but it also allows us to try again and to try to get it right again.
Yes, and as we try again, no shame, no condemnation, it's trying again. We've just got to do that. We've got to be so much more intentional about that.
You write about dignity both as a concept and a set of strategies. Will you distinguish the two for us?
So yes, on one level, dignity as a concept. Why dignity? I am very much interested in the gaps that we as communities face when we have aspirational identities, when we have mission statements, we have goals, we have vision statements. And what happens is that sometimes who we say we are is not aligned with who we are, what we do. Who we say we are is not aligned with what we are doing and how we are living. I'm really interested in narrowing that gap. But part of why it's so difficult to narrow that gap is because those sorts of barriers to that alignment they live within us, and we experience them in very visceral ways. They're very difficult challenges. They're challenges that are connected to loyalty, to loss, to grief. These are the challenges that require attitudinal changes, cultural changes. These are very visceral, very difficult areas in which to change, to make that alignment possible. But in that very area where those challenges reside is also where dignity resides. And dignity is unwavering and it is relentless. We all have it. So wouldn't it be the anchor for us? So when it comes to these very difficult conversations, these opportunities for change, the leadership expert Ron Heifetz calls these types of challenges adaptive challenges. These are not simple, easy to fix challenges because they are so tied with that visceral part of each of us. We can all, I'm sure, think about moments where we have experienced dignity violations. Each and every one of us, we can think of those moments. So I would like us to use that as the concept, dignity. I want us to use that as the anchor for these conversations. But wasn't it such a wonderful and serendipitous coincidence that each of these letters could spell out the strategies which I think are key to solving these challenges? If we say we are to respect the dignity of every human being, then certainly we're going to encounter difference. Every one of us are different. So different experiences, perspectives, different livelihoods, different approaches. So the D in dignity is diversity. And that's all it means, is difference. I hope that for a moment we can suspend what we think we understand by that term, diversity, and just realize what it really is. Differences, different backgrounds, different cultures, different identities, different perspectives, just difference. And then identity, that's our anchor. That is where we, in all of our institutions, even in our day-to-day lives and our individual selves, our identity is who we are and who we say we are. And that's where we always must go back to. And then G, growth. There's always going to be need for growth, growth in our competency, growth in courage to try something new, growth in our ability to be reflective, to pause, to look again with courage and bravery, growth in our capacity to have some very difficult conversations, growth to interact with people who are different from us and who believe differently and who we disagree with. N is nurturing. We have to be able to nurture ourselves, as in equip ourselves with the tools necessary to do all of this difficult work. This is hard work. Make sure that we are educated. We have in place ways in which we can nurture and create an environment where we can go forward with these new initiatives and innovations and creative solutions. And then there is integrity. We must hold ourselves accountable. Are we doing what we say we're doing? If we keep on asking ourselves that in every new initiative that we bring into our institutions, into our schools, if we ask ourselves, is this in line with who we are? I think that's very important. That could really bring about sustainable change. And there's transparency. We must know our stories and be able to articulate those stories and to develop trust with all of us who are participating in this very difficult work. That because it resides, these challenges resides in these visceral moments, we have to be able to develop a sense of trust. So transparency is key. And then of course, yield. I hope that people don't walk away with the thought that this is just some esoteric way of thinking. This is rooted in data. It's rooted in facts and figures. If we don't have that part, if we say, oh, we want to grow in this capacity, but we are not measuring ourselves or articulating the deliverables and the outcomes, then that's a problem. And so the why has to be yield. So yes, dignity, yes, as a concept, but now I'm so grateful that each of those letters were able to create this wonderful lens through which we could see and develop these strategies.
Normally, I think it's fair to say in our culture, we treat authenticity, the word and the idea of authenticity, in individualistic ways. But you're talking about it in relation to communities. And I'm curious, what do you mean by authenticity in a community? And why is this important? And then what does it mean to be an authentic educational community?
As I said before, I'm really interested in the gaps between who we say we are and what we're doing, how we're living that out. I'm really interested in narrowing that gap. That, to me, is authenticity. If we can align what we say and what we do, that's authentic. This past summer has revealed, I think, for many of our schools, that we are not actually living out what we say we're living out. We often talk in our school communities, our educational institutions, about building community. And we all, I feel, can say that our institutions are grappling with or challenged with the gaps in that. How do we make sure that those gaps don't exist? And that if we are constantly thinking about that, then we can really begin to find ways to narrow that gap. And when we have an authentic community, we can truly maximize and leverage not only our mission as educational institutions for transformation for our students, but we can maximize the impact we have in the world. We can maximize our place and positionality in the world, maximize all those who are part of these institutions, leverage that. That's why it's so important. Dan, you see that I've been in many different educational institutions. I so admire and respect them, and I feel very personally that I have benefited so much from these institutions. I am a believer in education. I'm a believer in the mission of transformation, of creating for our students, for our young people, moments of enlightenment and certainly critical thinking. And if we don't create an environment where our students feel as if they can do that, they don't feel like they belong, or if we are missing the mark in terms of creating an authentic community, then we do ourselves and our students and our young people a disservice, a grave disservice.
Great disservice, yes. You begin your book with what we might call an institutional tale, which showcases multiple perspectives on an event. Why was this an important way to begin your book? And it seems to me there's a dual challenge here. On the one hand, for communities to be sort of a team, single-minded institution focused on mission, common mission and purpose. But there's also the reality of individual perspectives and the encouragement we give to that to make up a community. How do you navigate that challenge in your book?
So yes, I did begin the book with a story, an institutional tale. I like that, yes. And it was important to show that one incident could be experienced in multiple ways by constituents of that community. And that is very important to recognize, to value, and to leverage, because each of those perspectives matter, each of those perspectives is important, and each of those perspectives needed to be shared and voiced, speaking to one another, in order to make that incident or that innovation or one that actually was amenable and that was helpful and effective for all. What is important is that we need to mobilize all of the voices. We need to hear them all. And I wanted to be able to not only create a moment for the reader to position themselves within that particular story and see what their perspective was, but then to really look again at what another person could possibly be seeing, even as we look at the very same incident, the very same focus.
It's something I think our country has become painfully aware of this past summer, is that different people see our country in very different ways. And we can no longer assume that our view is shared by everyone else, or that the world is perceived in that way.
Yes, and our educational institutions are microcosms of the world. And so if we are in our communities here, not allowing for the different voices to be heard, to be valued, I think that's an issue. We need to have these. Dignity work is difficult work. Dignity work is uncomfortable work. It is uncomfortable, it is difficult, it is challenging work. And it means positioning ourselves in places that we would not necessarily want to be positioned. But if we don't talk to each other, and we don't listen to one another, and we don't value what each other is saying, it's going to become explosive. All of the parts I was talking about in adaptive challenges, the visceral effect, they have to do with loyalties and loss and grief. We are going to have to decide at some point, okay, I'm going to have to lose a little bit here and be okay with that. This person is going to gain something here and be okay with that. Or we're going to have to agree to disagree, but we're going to do it because I recognize the dignity in you and you can see that in me. We have a common feature here, and we must remember that.
So what do you hope for schools and educational institutions as a result of this?
Because I am such a firm believer and an admirer of education, I want us to strive for authenticity in our communities. I want our institutions to be in line with the laudable and beautiful and admirable mission and purpose statements that we articulate. I want the aspirational identity to become our lived reality. And I want us to continue to always think about ways we can do that. What I love about the dignity model is that it is not linear. It is not linear, but each one of these strategies needs to be engaged in order to be effective. Not only is it not linear, it is not relegated to leaders in our schools or in our institutions and in our communities. This is work that we can all pick up, that we can all engage in by virtue of being a member of our institutions. We have that power, every single one of us. And if we know that this is a common theme that we are going to align with, then we can all begin that work. It may seem very difficult to get people mobilized, but what we're getting mobilized around is that identity. We're going to need to get mobilized about what it is that we say and who we are. And then everything, that's the anchor. That's the anchor. And we can begin to do all of this difficult work around that. You can hop on at any point. It's like a merry-go-round. You can hop on with the Y, you can hop on with the G, you can hop on with the T, you can hop on wherever it is, but each part must be engaged, and it belongs to us all.
What's your hope in writing this book?
I hope that the word dignity, it appears around boardroom tables and conference tables. I hope that as people are sitting across in their teams and their staff meetings, that the word dignity comes up and people will say, oh, what's the G again? Oh, growth. What ways do we need to grow here? What competences do we need to grow in? Are there things that we actually need to numerically grow in? Do we need other people in here? What about that D, diversity? Do we need other sorts of folks here on the team? Who is here and who isn't here, and why aren't they here? And why are they here? I want us to start to question and to reflect and to use this as an opportunity for us to try something new, to be reflective for us as an institution, because ultimately we want to be that authentic community. And I want us to use it. So yes, I would love for dignity to be on all of our lips. That's what I want. Want that word in front of us always. And we could use it more and more, but it's a strategy and it's a strategic lens that we can shift the way we see and be bold enough to be innovative and to be Imagineers and to try something and be bold about it.
Thank you, Beth Sarah. I wanted to remind our audience that we're going to be very shortly opening up for questions from all of you. So please use the Q&A feature and we'll get to some of those questions. I have a question of my own, though. I know that you have been working with this model for quite some time, and obviously prior to the dual pandemics that we've been going through in the past 6 months. What particular challenges do these days present to your model? Or are there unique ways that dignity is of particular relevance right now?
Oh goodness, I couldn't have created a more opportune time for this book to come out.
I would agree. Yeah.
Dignity I've heard that word in so many different conversations more than ever in recent months and weeks. As we think about the dignity of the hundreds of thousands of people who have died across the world, I think about the ways in which that we are working with and supporting all those on the front lines who are working so hard. I think about the dignity of livelihood, and that many people have lost their jobs, are unable to maintain their livelihoods. I think about in terms of the racial inequity and the racial reconciliation that's happening right now in this country. I think about the dignity or lack of dignity of certain people. I think about how important it is that we need to introduce or reintroduce dignity into all of these conversations. I think there are many opportunities right now to think about the authenticity of the nation's aspirational identity. We use laudable terms. They're so beautiful and so powerful. And yet there are so many gaps in that. How can we begin to really think about and reflect on narrowing those gaps? But as you can see, there is explosive responses to different ways and approaches to doing that. They're explosive. And that is not something that we in our schools are unfamiliar with. I'm sure that we can consider and reflect and think of ways that we have tried to narrow some gaps in our schools or institutions, and there have been some explosions. So I hope that, yes, dignity as a concept needs to be reiterated. We need to bring that back. But I think as a strategy, there is some hope here. I think that we can use some of these tenets to make a difference and to try to narrow some of those gaps. Even on large scale, large institutions, I think this can be useful.
Thank you. One of the questions from our audience is, can you think of some ways to introduce the concept of dignity in our institutions? How do we bring that in?
That's such a wonderful, wonderful question. I think we can start by simply putting the tenets out there, sharing with key stakeholders in our community. But as I said, this is the type of work that belongs to us all. We can do this. We can all be mobilized around this. This is about developing, mobilizing everyone, mobilizing the constituents in your community beginning to ask pertinent questions, beginning to ask, what do our teachers need or what do our students need, listening to voices. I think under the diversity, under the D, it's about starting to ask some new questions. Who is around, who isn't, what needs are there, what is the yield, what is the aspiration that we would like to achieve, and then using each parts of this strategy to ask helpful questions and to reflective questions to develop some new innovative ideas and what I call Imagineering, using the data and using to make informed decisions. Imagination is free and it is wild and it's expansive. How can we begin to think imaginatively and not be afraid to share all of these wild and innovative ways of thinking about solving those solutions, so solving those problems. So I think presenting the lens in a way that is, this is about us living more into who we are. And then identifying the particular challenges that we are dealing with, whatever they may be. They don't have to be around race or identity. They can be all sorts of issues and challenges that we face, and really reserving this work for those challenges that go beyond the technical fixes. These are truly the adaptive challenges that cannot be outsourced or should not be outsourced. They should be taken up by us all. I hope that is helpful.
Yes, thank you. Another question from our audience. At times, institutions don't realize that they are in fact dishonoring the dignity of others. So what would you suggest to help institutions recognize policies and systemic processes that do not honor the dignity of some members of that community?
Well, I think we need to look into all of those. If you want to do, I talk about conducting audits around indeed our policies. Let us take a moment. That's what I like about dignity, the strategy, the lens, is that it asks us to pause. And it asks us to be reflective. So perhaps this is the beginning of a retreat at the beginning of the year, who knows? And this is a moment to say, okay, I want us to look at the particular policies around X. And perhaps this is, well, just who is included in that and who isn't? And have we heard from our students? Do we know that this might be something? Or what about our faculty? We're always, in many ways, we're looking for the gaps. We can't assume that what we have covers it all. And if we do, that's wonderful. But let's look for the gaps. Let's try to look again, to look and see what are the gaps. How often do we actually sit around a boarding room table and ask ourselves, oh, what are we not doing?
Or who is not here?
Or who is not here?
Another question. Our boarding school community focuses quite a bit on allowing students to tell their stories through expressive writing, through community conversation and talks, and through the informal and sort of gray parts of the day. However, I don't think we do this very well. I think we do this very well, the question goes. However, I'm not sure we are always intentional in teaching our students how to listen to those stories. What techniques might you suggest to help our students learn how to listen with dignity?
What a wonderful question.
Yes.
So kudos to the boarding school community that is doing that kind of work. How wonderful to encourage students to tell stories. As part of my work with mental health and mental health advocacy, I talk about the power of telling our stories and how important that is, and encouraging people to tell even the most unflattering parts of our stories. And that includes our institutions. Can you imagine if our institutions were also to look at the most unflattering parts of our stories? But yes, to be able to not only write them, but to share them. And then when we lay out the rules, when we lay out and remind people of the dignity that we all share, I think it's important, yes, to say that and to ask folks to listen and actively listen, and to be respectful and to remember that dignity is at the core. We can always talk about what a dignity violation may feel like and how we can be aware of that in those contexts. I think active listening is important, asking questions. I think you can encourage that. What exactly does that mean? And not be afraid. We can encourage to build, to create an environment where courage and confidence and trust is nurtured and encouraged. We want to raise the floor height of how we listen to each other. We want to say to each other, I see the dignity in you, you see my dignity, and I'm going to be curious. I'm going to be curious. We can talk about kind candor. We can say, I don't agree with what you're saying, but with the utmost of kindness. This doesn't have to always dissolve into anger or dissolve into arguments. This can be about questioning, critical thinking, asking questions, trying to understand, trying to see from the other perspective. I do think it's such a wonderful thing to tell the stories, but how do we use them afterwards? How do we share them? How do we, in moments where there is awkward moments, how do we as adults, perhaps teachers, perhaps administrators, in a moment say, remind folks about dignity and remind them that actually that kind of comment was really inappropriate, and we need to, why did you say that? Why is that such a moment of pain for you? And to delve further and further into that. Why are you so angry about that? Oftentimes anger is just an easier emotion than hurt. And hurt, sometimes if we were to dig a little deeper and peel back the layers, we might actually find something else. So be curious. Be curious.
Thank you. Another question. Mission is clearly important, but do you think it's also important for organizations to articulate a clear sense of values like integrity, inclusiveness, empowerment? And why do you think many organizations fail to do this? And is this important to the dignity framework?
Well, absolutely. That's part of the aspirational identity, isn't it? It's wonderful to have those words up, but they are meaningless without action. And that's the authenticity part. We can have those and say that these are the values that we uphold. This is what we believe in. This is what we want in our community. But if we are not doing it, then we are missing the mark. There is a gap. There's an opportunity to narrow the gap. The second part of that question was, you said, is it important to have those? Could you repeat that part for me, please?
Why is that important to the dignity framework?
Yes, absolutely. I think articulating the values it's incredible and very important and laudable and admirable, but without meaning, as I said, without action. And we have to be constantly asking ourselves and holding ourselves accountable to the very words that we say.
Another question. I'm interested in hearing more about the integrity audit. and its four main attributes in introducing change opportunities within a community.
I think an audit is a self-audit, an integrity audit. That's more about reflecting on who we are and asking those questions. So if I were to link that to the question beforehand, if we have all of these wonderful values that we say and that we espouse, how can we, when we look at those values, how are they being lived out? How are they being lived out in the classroom? How are they being lived out on the playground? How are they being lived out in our athletics? How are they being lived out? We can ask ourselves to be reflective about that, but be willing to be honest and transparent about the most unflattering interpretations of how we may be living out or not living out those ideals. We don't always have to be defensive. We don't always have to be defensive. And being nice and being polite is not always a panacea for the very difficult work of dignity work.
That leads into the next question. How do you agree to disagree without sacrificing your own integrity?
What a wonderful question.
Yes.
But I think that is, that in many ways resides within you. It resides within you as well. I think right now, that's a great question across our nation. There's such divisiveness right now about how we perceive American life. And I think that within these moments, when you bring that back to the schools and in our institutions and in our communities, we can listen, we can look again, seek to try to understand, strive to understand. And we can agree to disagree, but that wouldn't be sacrificing your integrity. You are believing what you believe. I think that resides within you.
Leading on to our next question, this is a challenging one. In this contentious election year, how do we help our students to see the dignity of each candidate?
You know, in many ways, I think we leave that, we're very intentional about that within the classrooms. Our teachers have to ask some questions. Our teachers in those moments need also the personal part of that in our teachers and that reside in our faculty members who are conducting conversations needs to be suspended in those moments. Because what we're trying to do here is to raise the climate and raise the expectation that we can be critical, we can be curious, we can ask some new questions, we can seek to try to understand another side, we can seek to try to understand why you might believe something and I believe something else. We can raise that up but always remembering that we actually are not that different from each other because we all have this common element of dignity. I may thoroughly disagree with you, but it doesn't mean that I don't see in you the potential to be a wonderful human being, the vast possibility of actually finding some common ground and understanding. Can we pause for a moment to actually have a healthful conversation?
And part of that, I think, is the value of adults modeling that behavior to students.
Very much so.
In all of these. Another question, how can we introduce and use the concept of dignity in communities where that concept may not be understood or valued? Can these strategies still be helpful in those situations?
You know, I spent a lot of time in the introduction of this book to say that this dignity work is difficult work, but that this work is not a result of a political imperative or a moral imperative, that this work is not about recognizing difference and engaging in potentially a paralyzing world of political correctness, or that this is not about silencing our opinions in order for other people to talk, or to silence our assumptions. This is not about putting on a gab. This is not about a canceling culture or a cancel culture. I think that's a popular phrase right now. This is not about a cancel culture. Dignity work, if we don't recognize that we're human beings, then I think we have a very big problem. If we cannot be on the same page about being human beings and our common humanity, then I'm afraid that we're in a spiral that I don't want to be a part of. Dignity is not, I want to use that as a strategy, a lens to shift the way we see. I am not asking for people to love one another and to be best friends. It's not about kumbaya. This is about very difficult, challenging work. It is about shifting the way we see. And shifting the way we see one another and see ourselves. All in order to maximize the efficiency of our institutions and our communities. If you're not interested in that work, then I don't think you need to be a part of an institution. If you're not interested in maximizing the efficiency of your community, of your institution.
Another question, in what ways can dignity be measured?
Wonderful question. Dignity as a concept is something that resides in all of us, and it has a vast possibility and potential. There's no way to measure one's dignity. Sometimes people think of the word respect, like you respect someone because they've earned it. I don't talk about it that way. I talk about respect as an action. It's a verb. I am willing to look at you again and look at your dignity. Dignity is unwavering, it is immeasurable, and it is relentless. When you're talking about measurables in terms of the dignity strategy, when you're talking about the yield at the end of that, that is where you have to decide within your community, what are the measurables? What are the outcomes? How do we measure them? How do we put the goals, articulate the goals, and how do we know when we've reached them?
One more question before we conclude. Saying we all have the power is a wonderful concept, but many institutions are very top-down. How can individuals make an impact relating to dignity when the case might be that everyone's voice is not valued?
A great question, which is multi-layered. I do think when it comes to challenges, these sorts of adaptive challenges, part of the solution to these challenges is mobilizing the whole, is giving the work back. If I understand that some of our communities are built that way in terms of a top-down structure, it may be incumbent upon that leader to think about ways to democratize the work. It is very important. And yes, I agree that having the power to do this work, yes, I do strongly believe that it can occur and resides within our individual spaces. I can make a difference. I can acknowledge the dignity in my particular space, in my cubicle, in my classroom, in my office, with my team, with my group, student group, with my, as I coach. I can do that because I know that the institution says X, Y, and Z, or we uphold these values. And if I am not doing that in my space, then how can the institution as a whole do that? So if we recognize in our individual spaces that I can do that, I can implement that work, and I can live out those values, and I can align what I do and shift my work from tasks to actually tasks that live out the mission, then you've done it. You've implemented your power.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I simply want to say that what I so value about this book, which I've read, as well as the discussion today, is that, for one thing, you take institutions seriously and lovingly. And in an age where institutions are being challenged or are very suspicious, that's a very important thing. And I think there's a realism and an understanding of where we start from in your book, but also a tremendous challenge to move ahead, to move forward, and an encouragement that we can do this work. It is not easy work, but we can do this work. So I want to thank you for providing all those things and the many more things that the book provides to all of us. So I'm going to have you have the last word, Beth Sarah, as we conclude today. And before she concludes, I simply want to thank everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that has been of a real passion of mine, really all my life, and I didn't even know it. But every moment, every experience in my life has contributed towards this grappling with this idea of dignity. I do hope for us that we will continue to think about this, and in as much as you can to bring that back into all of your conversations. And I do want to say too that the dignity model can also be shifted, while I'm talking a lot about institutions, can also be reflected on ourselves. And we can think about ourselves through this lens, because that's a very big part of that too. As from my work with mental health, it's a very important part for us to see ourselves with that dignity always at the forefront. I do want to remind people, please, if you can, know that the book is available at churchpublishing.org/dignity right now on a discount, 25% discount. And they are, because we're living in this beautiful virtual world, they are going to be personalized. So when you receive them, they will be personalized from me. So I just want you to know that, and thank you for coming out and sharing this time with me and with us. Dan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Heather, thank you for being there and helping out with all of this wonderful conversation. And to all those out there, my last encouragement to you is to look again. Just look again. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth Sarah. Thanks to all of you. Ooh.